It's on a couple of panels too. Yesterday night we had a pretty successful sort of conversation, not quite a debate, but ended up being one at the chapel, which was rather entertaining. So yeah, a few of you I can see were there.
Yeah, that was a really, really good talk. It's true. So there's no way that I'm going to be as eloquent as Marcus. Obviously, that's not possible. But anyway, I hope you enjoy what you see here. I'm going to talk about a project called Substrate Independent Minds, and I'm going to try to explain first why this sort of thing is important. So where does the idea come from, and then how does it happen? How can you do something like this? And of course, I'll also explain what the word means. So I'll start off with just this notion that as we all go into the future, and as your children and your grandchildren are going into the future, obviously we all want them to have a good future. And when we talk about a good future, that's something that we call, or if it's a very good future, we call it a utopia. And when it's something bad, then we call it a dystopia. And we all know what dystopias are because we come across them in movies, we come across them in books. So we know about the scenarios where somehow the Earth gets wiped out or something happens to all of us, but it doesn't have to be as bad as all of that, and it can still be a dystopia. So for example, you could have a situation where civilization as we know it breaks down, or the infrastructure that we have breaks down, or the economy breaks down. And in fact, you could say that there are quite a few people right now who are living in a dystopia somewhere in another country where there's a war going on or something of that form. So we all know what that is. Now, what makes the difference between a dystopia and something that's better? Well, one of the things that really matters is civilization. It's this notion that there is something there that we can hang on to that allows us to live for more than just pure raw competition between individuals of a society. Now, what is it that makes a civilization, or what makes this thing that allows us to live like that? Well, the important thing that's been going on everywhere in the universe, and not just in biology, is selection. I'm just calling it selection, not even natural selection, because selection goes on all the time. It's this idea that there are things that work better under certain circumstances. Say, for example, you have a large porous asteroid and you have a small dense asteroid and they collide. Probably the small dense asteroid is going to survive and there are going to be bits and pieces left of the other asteroid. So you could say there's been a selection there. Selection happening everywhere. This is called universal Darwinism. So this is kind of what's been happening all over the place. And of course it's happened in biology as well. And it's led to the development of a variety of different things. For example, we have come out of a selection of a random walk of different things that have been happening in evolution and that provided us with the ability to communicate with other people. That's something that came out of this. And communication is really very important because it's a basis of being able to cooperate in a way. It's a basis of expressing your ideas and who you are, empathizing with other people. It makes it possible to go beyond this competitive thing towards cooperation. And of course, so this concept of selection, I'm going to get back to that in just a moment. I'm just going to go on a slightly different tack for a moment because we were just talking about empathy. Empathy is actually a very important cornerstone of what we would call a civilization that is a good civilization. It's this ability to put yourself in another person's mind to some degree, to understand what's going on there, and to understand why this person's coming at something, at a problem, or at a situation with a different perspective than you are, perhaps. And maybe we're not perfect empaths, but we have some amount of empathy. And empathy allows us to get from cooperation that is basically just achieved through coercion, you know, you've got the strongest in the pack, and the strongest in the pack leads all the rest, to something that's more cooperative. So one of the things that I find important in going forward is actually to improve the way that we can be more empathic, so to understand more about people, that we have a better insight in why do some people believe this and others believe that, and making it easier for us all to work together. That's an interesting thing to go toward in the future. Now getting back to selection again for a moment, one of the important things to remember is that the way that evolution worked is that it took place in a certain environment, in a certain time, to meet certain challenges. And they just happened to be the way they were, and selection occurred and we ended up in some niche there. So did everything else. The trees outside are another niche in that evolution, and so are all the different animals that are there. But this doesn't mean that if something changes, let's say that the environment changes drastically, or a challenge comes along that we've never encountered before, that it's easy to hop from one niche to another. So it's not as if you can do those kinds of jumps. That's not usually what happens when there's evolution. What happens is that a bunch of things that were in those niches just disappear, and something else happens to work out better. So we don't necessarily want to be in one of those niches when something like that happens, because we know that things are not going to stay the same. The status quo is not something that we can maintain forever. We know that we're already changing the environment around us, and we're changing the challenges that are there. We deal with a lot of different kinds of data today than we used to, and it's becoming hard for us to keep up, so we rely on technology to keep up with it for us, and we have to change the way we think. We look in Wikipedia to get our exact data, and we just need to know how to look for it, rather than remembering all the dates of things that have happened in history and stuff like that. So we're already changing how we're thinking. And of course, this isn't the first time that's happened, but we have to keep up with it. Now, in the future, we could have entirely new kinds of challenges. For example, we may be competing with intelligence that is intelligence we've created, which is different, and that may be better at some things than we are. Or we may be competing with situations in the environment that we haven't been dealing with before, or we may have a challenge such as, let's say, eventually, the sun is going to expand and it's going to turn the Earth into a cinder. That's just the way it is. And then you have to move somewhere. But if you have to move and you need to take your entire biosphere with you, you have to have something all the people can live in. This becomes really difficult. There are other ways to go about it. So what I'm getting at is that if you look at this from a big picture perspective, long range, then the kinds of things that seem to persist well in a universe with different challenges and different environments, the sort of things that are going to have the biggest impact or have a meaning in a sense, are the things that are the most adaptable. So if we're looking at intelligence that has an impact on the universe that really changes things in some ways that seem interesting, it's going to be intelligence that's very adaptable, very flexible. And we have the option to be that sort of thing, because right now we have this window of opportunity. We've got a global infrastructure, we've got a global economy that's a bit shaky, and we've got a global science that can point at things. All I'm saying is you've got the opportunity now, and it's kind of like with everything else, if you put it off to tomorrow, you don't know if you're going to have that opportunity, because 10, 20 years from now, who knows what's happened to the economy or the infrastructure. And do you want to look back and say, well, is that chance? I don't know. So what can you really do? Well, becoming more adaptable is really about augmentation. It's being more than you are naturally. And that's really something that humans have always done. So I really think it's part of who we are. Humans are augmenters. We've got clothes on, we've got the cell phones, we've got the cars and the houses and all this stuff. I mean, who here is not augmented? Hardly anyone is living in a non-augmented life. Probably no one. So this isn't something new. This is something that's been going on for a long time. Now, when we're thinking about how you can make yourself more adaptable, more flexible, I think one of the things that you need to consider is, what are you trying to preserve? What is it that is really interesting about it? What is it that you would want to make so adaptable that it could persist under even new challenges and environments that are coming along? So it's really a question about who we are, what we are. What is interesting about what's going on here? Now, when I think about being and what I'm really interested in, I'm usually not too interested in, for example, my DNA. Sure, DNA is important because DNA is important in telling us whether or not we're going to get a certain disease or something like that. But in reality, I'm not keeping track of my DNA strand and exactly what the code is and whether it's this successful or that successful and how many people with this DNA have, I don't know, what are these families doing? Like, we don't really keep track of that. The thing that we're interested in is usually things like historical achievements, science, art, stuff that's going on in the, I guess, the meme space, you could say. It's the thoughts, it's the thing going on up here. And it gets even deeper than that, because really down in the fundamentals, what we are is we're creatures that are developing, they're creating a sense of self, we're creating a sense of our environment and everything that's there. But what is that really? This idea that there is a me, that there is a you, that we're all here, it's really all being generated somewhere, right? Because I can't even contemplate my own senses. I don't even understand what I'm hearing or seeing until something's being processed in my mind.
Now, there isn't really any reason why those kinds of processes can only take place in the type of matter that's going on in your brain, or at least we don't know that there is a reason why that kind of constraint would exist. No one's shown us a constraint like that. All we know is there are things in there that are processing in some sense. And so this is what the project really is about. It's the idea that you can augment further if you can understand how these processes are going on in the mind, that you can then move them to other types of substrates. It's like taking a program and being able to run it on different platforms, different kinds of computers on a Mac or a PC or whatever. And that you can then come up with ways to improve, to create new adaptations that allow you to perhaps remember things as precisely as a database does, or solve problems the way a quantum computer would by just kind of annealing into a solution. So if you can actually take what we have in our brains right now, this mind that's being generated, and move it to substrates where you have direct access and you can do those things, then you get to that adaptability, to the flexibility. And to do this, there's a project going on right now. And the project is called whole brain emulation. That's another term that we use for emulating the actual details of what's going on in the physiology in our brain. So you've got neurons in there and synapses and things like that. Now, why would you do that to try to achieve this mobility of the mind? Well, the reason is because we don't really understand how the mind works. If you ask a neuroscientist today, how is it that I can recognize my mother? Or do you understand how the mind works? Then any honest neuroscientist is going to say, I have no idea. No, we don't know. Because when you say, do I understand, then people are asking, do we know how from the very top level right down to the details, to the nitty-gritty cells, do we understand how all this stuff works together? What are the strategies there? That's really what you want to know if you're saying understanding. We don't know that. What neuroscience has been doing for the last 100 years is we've been looking at the very bottom level, identifying certain kinds of neurons, identifying synapses, and learning how we can measure stuff. But of course, one thing we can assume is that if we have all this stuff there, these neurons, these synapses, that's what creates mind in an emergent fashion. So if you can take that and you can reconstruct it, so you can basically copy all of those little details, and if you do it faithfully, then you should be able to create a mind, right? Now to do that, there are really four main things you need to be able to do. And I've written them down here. I'm going to go through them on the other slides in just a moment, so I think I'll just move right on. Oh yeah, this is just a sort of aside. We call this system identification. We're trying to recognize what all these pieces are doing. I'll get into that in a moment. So the first, let's see, how do I talk about this? Yeah, let me just check if I have the other slide. Okay, I have that. Maybe it's better to just go through that there. Yeah, the first thing that you need to do if you want to achieve whole brain emulation is that you need to know where to look. You need to know which resolution you're supposed to look at. Is it good enough to look at individual neurons? Should we look at ensembles of neurons? Should we look at something smaller? Should we look at pieces of those cells and what's going on in there? Is that what you need to grasp if you want to understand how this mechanism works? Also, what is the scope? If you're trying to get a mind to work, do you need to look at the cortex? Do you need to look at that plus the spinal cord? Can you look at just a piece of that, like the hippocampus or the prefrontal cortex or something like this? So there's the matter of scope and resolution. This is an exploratory thing. There are hypotheses that need to be tested there. And there's interesting work that goes on there. For example, recently, a year ago, a couple of people came up with a way of testing whether or not we could reconstruct pieces of retina and make some prediction about how the functions of those cells worked. And they were indeed capable of doing that by looking at this ultrastructure, at the neurons and the synapses and how they were connected. So this gives us some idea of whether this can work. The other thing you need, of course, is something that you would build this new mind on. You need an emulation platform, something that could run all that kind of complicated hardware, something like a brain. It's an interesting question anyway. Now, one of the ways that you can try to reconstruct is you build something like this. It's called a compartmental model of a neuron. So a neuron is represented by all kinds of little cylinders that each of them are basically like a little electrical compartment that has a capacitance and a resistance and some functions that describe what's going on here. Now, if we take that description and we look at how many bits of activity have to go on in this neuron every second, which was computed by going backwards from how much energy does the brain get. Our energy gets about between, say, 20 and 40 watts. It's like a light bulb. That's what goes into our brain. And you know how much energy is required for a single action potential. That's when a neuron spikes, and for it to push that action potential out to other cells. So you get an idea of how many of these action potentials are going on per second from that energy requirement of the brain. That's sort of a max. When you look at that, and then you say, okay, what would it take, how many computations to do the same number of action potentials with this model? Then it turns out that to run a brain, you need a computer that can do an exaflop of computations. That's a very, very big number. This is not teraflops, which is what, it's already big. Gigaflops is kind of like what your PC can do. Teraflops, petaflops, exaflops. It's really big. Right now, the biggest supercomputer can do about 10 petaflops. That's still 100 times too slow. Now, it's not really that bad because there are already projects that are saying that the United States, Japan, and even India are going to have exaflop computing centers by, say, 2017. So that means by that time you would have a system fast enough to run a whole brain emulation at real-time speed so that it would run just as fast as our mind would. It's a stupid way to build things. You wouldn't do that. And if you're going to build something with this kind of model here, it would be much better to have hardware that's actually suited to run that. So there's hardware that we call neuromorphic hardware. That's hardware that's built to work more like a neuron. There's a much better way to implement this than to run it on a supercomputer. But it's nice to know that, even if we didn't have the special hardware. So that's that. This is what's going on here. This is not working.
You're going to cancel the stopping of the road.
Do you want me to do that while you keep us talking?
Is that a mega flop?
Oh, I can't do that. It's right there. Here we go. Okay, so the third part of this roadmap, because if we're going to try to describe what's going on in the brain, you're not going to try to do it by describing what's going on in the entire brain all at once. It's too big of a problem. Way too many parameters. 100 billion neurons, trillions of synapses. Those are so many parameters that if you're trying to describe what's going on there just by looking at what's going in and what's coming out and thinking about what's processing this, what are those processes, you could never figure that out. You need to break it down into lots of tiny little problems instead, so small that each problem has only a few parameters. And the first step that you can do is you can take it apart in terms of the structure, decompose it. I already sort of gave away the result because I was talking about these compartmental models. That's kind of the lowest level, down to these little bits and pieces of a neuron, little dendrite pieces, little cylinders. Now, you can do this, for instance, by using electron microscopy. Take a piece of brain tissue, plastinate it, basically make it into a block of plastic, cut it really thin, put each one of those slices under an electron microscope. What happens is you get a stack of slices that you can build a 3D reconstruction from, and you can see everything. You can see individual synapses basically at that resolution. And these guys here, they did some really cool work last year. They're the ones I was talking about. They did some reconstruction of the retina, and they were able to predict the function of retinal cells from the structure. And here they did the same sort of thing in the visual cortex. I think I may actually have a movie here. Yes. So this is a reconstruction from a stack of slices like that. You've got a bunch of electron microscope slices, and you're reconstructing dendrites. So these connections for the neurons, these long pieces that go in there. So you can do this for larger volumes, and then eventually you have many different cells. You can see where they connect. Okay, so ultimately you end up with something like this. So you can see the different neurons there, where they are in space. Here's a blood vessel in there. And ideally you can also see where the synapses are, so where one neuron connects to another neuron. I'm not sure if that's visible in this one here. Probably not. Now, some people think that getting this kind of structure data is enough because we can already tell a lot of things. You can look at the structure, you can look at this morphology and say, oh, that looks like it's a pyramidal cell or an interneuron. These are different types of neurons. Some of them are excitatory, they cause more activity. Some of them are inhibitory, they depress activity. So you can say, okay, then they must have these kinds of functions, and we can use those to describe what's going on there. But that's not quite enough. I mean, there are so many parameters still that that's really not enough information. What you really also need to do is you need to functionally characterize what's going on. So just looking at it in structure is nice. It tells you what's there and how they're connected, so where can information flow. But you still need to know how that information is being processed inside individual cells. And this is really an area where there's a big gap in tool building right now. Neuroscience is not very good at this. So we want to be able to describe cells in functional form. I'm not going to get into that bit. But right now, you can just either stick electrodes into a piece of brain tissue and look at a few spots and take some recordings. Or you can do something like an MRI, where you get a look at the entire brain and you've got a very low resolution look at that, low resolution both in space and time. And it doesn't give you a lot of info about what's going on in there constantly. It's not good enough to do any kind of reconstruction. What we really need is new tools, and this is an example of a new tool that's being developed right now in a collaboration between Northwestern University, Harvard, and MIT. It's called a molecular ticker tape. The idea is that you have these strands of DNA that are being used as a medium that you can write information on. The DNA is being amplified, meaning DNA is being made longer. It's a piece of artificial DNA, so you know exactly what the code is. And as it's being made longer, as it's growing over time, there's activity happening in the neuron that this DNA has been stuck into. There's also a channel that's voltage sensitive. So when the neuron spikes, when it activates, that channel affects how the DNA is being amplified. It causes errors in the writing. So the errors represent the voltage that's happening. So it's actually a way of recording what's happening in that cell. And because this is being done biologically, you can take something like a virus and transfect all of these neurons and deliver these kinds of molecular ticker tapes to every single one of the neurons in the brain and record from all of them at the same time. So this is actually a project to try to get to full brain functional recording. And I'm happy to say that the first prototypes of these tapes have started appearing this year, so it's really cool. Yeah, there are other ways to go about it as well. You can try to make really tiny probes. What you see in here is work that was done putting microchips inside cells. That's a microchip that really is a microchip, as in it's 1 micron in size. The interesting thing is that if you have a microchip these days that is the size of a red blood cell has a diameter of 8 micron. With the technology that we have now in the silicon industry, even if you just make a flat piece of chip there, you can put as many transistors on there as the number of transistors that were used in the original guidance system for cruise missiles. So there's a lot you can stuff into a small space. And so we don't need to have those long electrodes that go in there and that disturb a lot of space where you can't stick a lot of them in. There's a new kind of technology we can develop. And this is the work that's being done right now to try to develop a micro probe, really. We call it a cyber cell. It's powered by infrared light, so these are basically like solar cells, but they're infrared sensitive. It has something that is similar to an RFID coil on it, but it's really a coil that is sensitive to infrared wavelengths and can passively deliver information back that way, and has the ability to do recording. And it can be put into the body by delivering it either in a piece of silicon, which is biocompatible, or sticking it inside a protein shell that is kind of similar to what a red blood cell would be like. I'm not sure how long this keeps on going, but this is showing that the idea here is to make them very, very simple. Each one of those agents does only one specific task, and you can have very many different types of agents doing different things, handing off information to one another and passing it out. Larger hubs are able to collect power and deliver the power to other cells by transferring it through infrared radiation and by delivering data out and doing other big tasks that are hard to do with the smaller cells. And the smaller cells can get into the interstitial spaces between, when I say cells, sorry, I'm calling them cyber cells. I'm so used to saying that, but then you get confused with biological cells. They're these chips, basically. The smallest ones fit between the interstitial space between cells, between the neurons. So they're small enough to get where you want to go. So it's the idea of using a team network approach. This one is not as far advanced as the molecular ticker tape. Not as far at all. This is still in the concept phase. It's an integration project, so none of these parts are something that doesn't exist yet. It's a matter of putting them all together. So for example, the infrared passive coil is something that was developed by a guy called Yale McGuire. He's really good at doing RFID technology at MIT. And basically everything else in there exists as well, but it still needs to be put together and tested. And that's it. Oh wow, okay, that was fast. But I don't want to miss this, right? Just one last thing there. I just wanted to remind you that the point of this entire talk is that, so we come all the way from what are we, like what is it that's really important about what we want to preserve and bring forward into the future as we start to live more and more with technology. How can we preserve what we call the human species and our interest in developing new ideas and memes, and how can we be more adaptive? Well, these are some ideas of what you can do. There are, of course, many other ideas, but they all share one thing in common, which is that they need people to work on it. It's really nice to go to a talk, like talks that you would see at Singularity Summits by people like Ray Kurzweil that will tell you that there are these curves showing us that technology is accelerating and we're going to get to this wonderful place called the singularity, which is a word I'm not very fond of. What that just doesn't say is that, you know, just saying there's accelerating change doesn't really tell you what it's accelerating towards. So even when things are accelerating, you still need to decide where you're going to aim it at, what you're going to do, and people need to be involved to do that. That's a really important thing to remember. And even then, I mean, it's not like these curves are laws of nature. It's not like it's gravity. Even that is something that needs to be achieved through effort. So I really think we have to take advantage of the fact that right now we have all of this. And it's what we can work with. And we don't know if you have that in the future, so we should do everything we can do right now as fast as we can. So that's really my point. Thanks.
Can I have one?
Yeah, sure.
In this shop, one of our best-selling books is by Sam Harris called Free Will. And it's a neuroscientist take on the old philosophical problem that of do we have free will, don't we have free will? And neuroscience is suggesting we don't. It seems to me that a whole brain emulation is going to confront very head-on that particular problem, in that one of the things that neuroscience seems to have identified is that mind seems to be a shell around which most of its functionality occurs, and our awareness happens within that conscious shell. The big problem there is going to be not one of the many. It seems to me it will be the relationship between that functionality and what we regard as ourselves. That particular problem, I guess it's more of a comment. It seems to be you could literally stumble through that at any time doing this whole brain emulation.
I think one of the most interesting things about working on this is that a lot of stuff that was previously just the domain of philosophy, that was something that you would think about and think, well, is this something, is it not there, do we, whatever, what's the situation? You can actually confront that and have to deal with it directly and learn something about it. So things that were just very theoretical become very practical. But at the same time, I'm also not entirely sure what the question of free will has to do with the matter of whether you can take something like the subjective sense of awareness and see that emerge from a mind that exists in a different substrate. Because if we say that functions like perception, our ability to hear something and make sense of it, is something that's being done in this circuitry, this neural circuitry that's there, and it's an emergent function. That's pretty mysterious. We don't really understand exactly how that works yet, but it's probably related to that, because we know that if there's damage in the circuitry, it doesn't work anymore. It's not clear to me that something like self-awareness would be any different. it's just as much one of those phenomena that are emerging from the system. Free will or no free will, you could probably make a copy of that thing and it will still have free will or no free will.
You could also make it entirely redundant.
Sure.
Thank you. I now go to my appreciation for opportunity. Thank you for organizing that. Last day I read a very beautiful book about the righteousness of mind. Let me explain for you. In the metaphysics, mind exists outside space and time. But Descartes, the philosopher of France, have problem divided mind and matter. In the philosopher of mind talk about that. I not go to mind, you cannot touch it, you cannot see it, go by speed of light. You study neuroscientist, you educated man, and appreciated you give us lecture. What about consciousness? What is it consciousness? And come from where? What happened when we die in the neuroscientist? Do you think consciousness, like a mind, we don't know how work? Or what is it, consciousness, illusion and delusion in the neuroscientists? Thank you so much.
I think that it's quite clear that we don't know what consciousness is. I mean, no one can tell you right now what consciousness is. All we can say is that you can tell that sometimes people are conscious and sometimes they're not, and certain things happen when they are or aren't. So there are certainly processes in the mind that are involved with consciousness. But consciousness is just as mysterious right now as perception or all these other things. In that we don't really have a top-down understanding of all the strategies that are involved. We don't really have where we can go to this big term, something called consciousness, and say, well, these are all the mechanisms that make consciousness happen. But in my opinion, it's very likely that consciousness is just as much an emergent phenomenon of what's going on in the neural circuitry as all these other things. I don't quite see a reason why it wouldn't be. If you're going to make a big claim and say that it is, then you should probably also provide some significant evidence that that's the case. That's just how I
Thank
see it.
you. Thank you.
Has Douglas Hofstadter influenced your work?
Douglas Hofstadter, has he informed my work? No, not very much.
So, there's an old hacker story at MIT about a switch with two labels. One is magic and the other is more magic. And the switch isn't connected to anything. But when you put the switch from more magic to magic, the computer stops working. So this is illustrative of the fact that our models of electrical phenomena aren't always entirely accurate. So, is it possible that evolution has produced similar tricks and the attempts to model the human brain doomed to fail?
Of course it's possible that it's doomed to fail. We don't really know if it's going to work until you have something that works. And until we have something that works, we can say that it's failed.
Okay.
But, and what you say is true. I mean, the thing about evolution is that it keeps taking shortcuts. It keeps just taking advantage of something that's there, right? Because it's a selection process. So that means that a lot of features, a lot of the mechanisms involved are interrelated in some way. And there can be very many different types of mechanisms. So for example, let's just take the neuron because that's what we're talking about. Neurons are sensitive to a whole bunch of things. Neurons react not just to electrical impulses, not just to ions. They react to temperature, they react to electric fields, they react to pressure, sound waves. Just like everything else in the universe, basically they react to every kind of signal you can give it. The question is, which ones of these signals drown in the noise? Which ones of these signals actually give us a relevant handle on the effects that we're trying to study, on what we're trying to capture here? There was one slide in here about system identification that I just jumped over. It's a really important one. In fact, I've done an entirely separate talk at Monash University just about that, and there will be a lot more about this in the future, because that's really about this crux of the matter, this problem of how do you select what is the effect you're actually interested in, and how do you select the signals that are involved. And what it really is an iterative problem. You start with a simple problem, you start with a simple model, because that's all we can do, and then you see if that captures what you want to capture, and then you add more as you need it. But yeah, it can be really complex.
Two-part question. One is how far scientists currently, at the moment, scientists as a collective, in creating a human brain outside of a human, like on a computer or such, one which can have free will and think for itself?
5%. No, when you say how far, it's of course you're asking for other things, and I'll get into that. I didn't mean to make light of it.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of different tacks that people are taking, because of course there's the entire field of artificial intelligence, which doesn't try to do this. It doesn't take a brain and try to decompose it into its basic parts and then build something that's a replica. The reason I'm interested in that is because I actually want to be able to help people who have real brains and make them adaptable to more things and stuff. So it has to apply to human brains, not to some other system that's been devised. But you can take the other approach, where you try to just look at what sort of functions do you think are important in humans, like language, object recognition, things like that, and build something that has those functions and see if you can get something that does what you want it to do. There are a lot of different ways of exploring that as well, and some people think that it gets so complicated with the integration of these different parts that you might as well do whole brain emulation, maybe. That, in my opinion, hasn't advanced as far as we'd like it to, because we have a lot of narrow AI that just does certain functions, but we don't really have this integrated general AI, what used to be called strong AI, that really has human-like ability to do many different things. Maybe we will have soon. Then there are people like Henry Markram in Lausanne, who is running the Blue Brain project, who are trying to do something rather similar to this, except that they're not taking scans of individual brains and reconstructing that. They're taking stochastic data collected from a bunch of different brains from rats, telling them how far away neurons usually are from one another, which neurons are usually connected with which other neurons and stuff, and then creating what is a generic cortical column. And I'd say he's advanced to the point where he has a good average cortical column. And cortical columns are important pieces because you can take those and replicate them a few thousand times and then you have a cortex. And what you can do then is you can try to run stuff on it, and he can already show that you can generate oscillations that you would normally see in the cortical columns and things like that. So there's some work there that's very promising, and there are other projects also that have gotten to that degree of success. So some things we can now model to a good degree, but most things no. So yeah, I think the 5% was actually pretty good. Yeah.
Randall, are all your simulations Turing computable, or do you bring in a few other exotic physics, quantum mechanics, pre-causality?
So far these are all based on trying to build compartmental models of neurons, so that's very standard stuff in neuroscience. It's there's nothing bizarre there, no quantum physics, none of that, just pure regular computation, all Turing computable. I haven't seen any reason yet to jump to something exotic. If someone can point out to me where a certain function in the brain doesn't work without some exotic component, great. But I'd need to see some evidence for that, because I could explore a gazillion different exotic components. Quantum processes are just one. Maybe string theory matters to the brain. I don't know. Yeah.
You mentioned before that you weren't interested in your DNA, but I think you really are, because it's a Darwin's theory, ancestors and descendants, we're all interested in it, and therefore
Really?
we're all
What is your DNA?
Hey?
What's your DNA?
CTAG. Some combination there.
How much more interesting is my strand of DNA than the strand of DNA?
But you are interested in your kids and your parents.
Oh, but I'm interested in them because of the what they exhibit. So what the DNA has created in them.
That's
the way
why
they
you're
are.
interested.
But not just that, also their learning, of course. But it's that. See, where it all began is that we are good environments for DNA to replicate, because really it's all about the survival of DNA. It's about successful DNA replication.
That's what I'm saying. Yeah.
Right. But that doesn't seem to be what we're actually interested in.
No,
Because we're interested in that environment. We're interested in this environment that happened to come about to help DNA successfully replicate. So it's that shell, the environment, the thing that exists to help replicators replicate successfully, that turns out to be the interesting thing for us, not the little CTAGG, because who the hell cares what that code is, really? I mean, is that really interesting? Why do I care if this code exists a million times on the planet and not the code of this ant over here. I mean, really, what are you going to do with that?
I mean, I understand what you're saying. I'm just being a bit facetious. One of the things that bugs me about nerdy conferences is that, well, I am a bit nerdy myself, so I'm guilty, but still, is that we all talk about we're interested in substrate independent minds, Dennett's theory and all the rest of it like that, which is great, which is mean replication, but the people who are interested in the substrate dependent minds, the gene replicators, they seem to be breeding pretty successfully, whereas we're not. You know what I'm saying? So it's like, sorry about that. I mean, who's going to win? You know?
No, but you're very good to put it all together. I mean, you are interested in your DNA because that's your morphology. That is what is your phenotype, your genotype, who you are, and that's your substrate. And your substrate has to have a mind to look after the. So when you talk about a substrate independent mind, that to me is mindless. Because the mind is serving the DNA. Like you talk about the ant, whatever you talk about, that they've got their own mind. But why does a substrate need a mind? I mean, it's what drives the whole thing.
That's a very good question.
Yeah.
Why does the substrate
What
need a mind?
I mean,
trees don't.
I mean, does a
have
rock have a
minds,
mind? Does a rock have a mind?
I'm turning this around on you.
Yes, I know.
There are lots of things out there that are successfully replicating their DNA and don't have a mind.
Well, that's debatable. Does it use a tree? I mean, a plant is an amazing piece of apparatus.
Sure,
I
it's
mean,
amazing.
it
doesn't
has
have any
roots.
neurons.
It has roots that communicates with the soil. And if it wants potassium, it will start to release chemicals into the soil, which will get a bug that will produce the potassium, whatever it is. So it is, whether you call it mindless, but
well, I'm not saying it's not
it is
alive,
interrogating
it
the
just
soil
doesn't have
all
a
the
mind.
time to get the nutrients it wants to grow. And so it is just amazing. And then they talk about the free will. We don't have the free will because we react to our environment, and our environment is demanding of us an interaction, and that interaction is what's giving us our thoughts. And so if something's coming around the corner, you've got to defend yourself. You don't really want to kill it.
Is this a question in 4 volumes? Come on,
Are you of the opinion, for example, that because of what you're saying about substrate, that it requires DNA, that so artificial intelligence would be impossible, for example? Do you think artificial intelligence is impossible?
It's not so much artificial intelligence. It's
It's
artificial.
different
It's
question.
artificial. Yeah, right. But it's artificial intelligence. I want to know where it's going. I mean, Terminator, all that sort of stuff. Why do we need all that? I mean, I'm arguing for the survival of the species.
Augmented human.
And if you're going to create a robot that produces its own artificial intelligence, it doesn't need humans.
No, I'm not actually trying to do that. I'm trying to do this thing, whole brain emulation. But I was asking you the question about artificial intelligence because you seem to be saying that you couldn't do something like this without DNA. And so that would seem to imply you couldn't have a mind without DNA. But that would also imply that you couldn't do artificial intelligence, for example. That's why I was asking that.
No, but what I'm saying is that why would you want to have a mindless mind without DNA? Without DNA, what's the mind? What is the mind?
If I can continue my mind without DNA, then, for example, I could become a spaceship and go somewhere else and live somewhere where there's no air because I don't need this body.
But what are you going to do with it? What are you going to do with your mind? Just exist.
What do I do now with my mind?
Eh?
What am I doing right now?
You interrogate your environment relative to yourself.
And you can still do that without
Can we go to another question? Just one over.
Sorry, I have a brief question that leaves more to the answer. Speaking to, say, some young people in the room who say are at university and say people in, say, high school, if you were to look at a lot of these young students today and recommend them, say, a path that would, as you said, Ray Kurzweil's, the notion of progress doesn't happen without people doing a lot of work. What are the most, promising fields of science that you see as emerging over the next, say, 10 years, 20 years? They're in want of good minds.
Well, some of the ones that have been successful recently are still going to be very important, of course, like the development of various kinds of information technology. But I think that the sort of the biosciences, so everything in the area of neuroscience and integrating neuroscience with computational technology, so like computational neuroscience, for example, neuroinformatics, that sort of thing is going to become increasingly interesting. Also, as it becomes possible to develop neural interfaces and brain-computer interfaces, neural engineering, bioengineering, that kind of thing will be very relevant. I can't actually imagine any field that's not interesting or relevant. Even, I'd say, art. It's really relevant, because what are we doing all this for, right? So, yeah, but as long as, it's not so much that people have to choose one specific field so they can contribute well to this. It's more that they need to be aware that this isn't just something that's happening and they should stand by and see, what the result's going to be. They're part of that process, so they have an influence on what the result's going to be. And I think everybody participates in that.
Do you think it's important for people to be kind of polymaths in a way, or multi-talented? That purpose, say, to be philosophically and artistically aware?
I would say whatever your best gifts are, what you're good at, because there are so many people who can be different types of experts. Experts are really useful, by the way. Experts are people who have studied something long enough. Usually it takes, 10, 12 years to become an expert in something. And the good thing about going to an expert with a problem is that they usually immediately see it from many more sides than you can, and they come up with solutions you wouldn't even have thought of. But there are experts out there in fields that we don't even think of as an expertise. So, for example, when it comes to all this stuff, what we need a lot of also is funding, for example. And people who can make money are experts at making money. And they can also contribute to something like this. So I think there are many different ways that people can contribute.
Thank you.
Yeah?
If the equivalent of a processor plus program in a neural net is training plus the neural net, but we seem to be quite good at training neural nets. I'm talking about simple neural nets to do something, to recognise a face or to some sort of a task like that. But I mean, well, my question is basically, do we actually understand the equivalent of an instruction in neural nets? I mean, do we actually have a rigorous sort of information theory about the way neural nets
There are
function?
models of how neurons work. There are different kinds of models of how neurons work. There are simpler ones like integrate and fire models, which just try to model when spiking occurs in neurons based on input. And there are other models that are much more detailed, like Hodgkin-Huxley equations that are being used in these componental models. So we have a lot of different ways of representing neurons, meaning that we have mathematical descriptions of how they work that you can then apply in a piece of machinery that carries out those processes. That is not exactly the same as converting what goes on in a neural net into instructions, except to say that if you have a model that is a software description of how a neuron works and that can carry out the same processing on the input that the neuron would and produce the same output, then yes, you've got these software instructions in your computer that are now doing what the neuron was doing. So in that sense, when we have a compartmental model, and we use this in computational neuroscience to run simulations of what a real neuron would be doing with a certain amount of electrical charge here and there, then yep, we actually have these instructions in our software that we're using for that model doing that. So we have an instruction equivalent.
If we take a trained neural net, can we look at the actual information that's stored in there in order to create a better functioning neural net, or do we simply have to introduce a more rigorous training regime?
Yeah, well, the rigorous training regime that I'm most interested in is the world that we live in. It's the kind of data that we receive all the time. It's how our brains are being trained. So I'm not really an expert at going through different kinds of training regimes. But the question that you're asking about coming up with something that is basically more optimized, that is better than the original neural net that we're talking about, it's actually a really interesting question. It gets right down to the how can you adapt something to be somehow better or more, have better performance, especially if you're moving it to a different hardware platform, where maybe you can have something that is more suited to that hardware platform. That's complicated right now because, as I was saying, we don't really understand very much except for the lowest levels of neuroscience at the moment. That's why emulation, this concept of basically recreating stuff exactly as we find it, is the way to go at the moment. ultimately, I'd like to, let's just keep it with software metaphors, I'd like to go from emulation to compilation, where you make something that's, you know, more high performance, converted to whatever is the assembly language or optimal code for some other platform. Yes, I'd like to be able to do that someday, but I think it's far away. Our understanding isn't there.
You mentioned wanting to find people who are experts at making money. And my question is, if you had $1 million to give to someone who is researching, making research towards progress, towards substrate independent minds, who would you give it to, or how would you make an attempt at
so Colin is behind you, he's pointing. Okay. Gosh, $1 million is so little. So, I don't even know how to divide that up between all the different groups that need money right now. But in this roadmap, there are a variety of projects that are already linked in there. And many of them need to keep going and need to get better at building the tools that they're working on. And there are a few gaps still where something needs to be put in. And for me, if I were to try to best fund what's going on here, and actually it's not just we're trying to, that's actually part of my job, that's part of what I do at working for carboncopies.org that keeps track of this roadmap, is to do exactly that, to find funding and find other groups and pull it together. And I would love to give funding to all of those groups that are involved with that, and others who have good solutions that fit in there. So I could name names, but I won't, just because I don't want to make some seem much more important than the others in that group. And all I would like to say is give way more than $1 million, because it's not enough.
One last question from anyone? In the middle here?
No, I think you already had a question. I mean, you haven't yet, so.
I've heard it mentioned a fair bit about mystical states, kind of, the activity in your brain is of, if not more intense in certain regions, is encompassing a larger area. Actually, what do you think of mystical kind of approaches, and what is attention and with inhibitory neurons and excitatory neurons? And is it an opening of gauge, or is it, do we already have more potential than we
This sounds really similar to that question of, oh, you're only using 10% of your brain.
Yeah.
So the mystical states and how much activity, I don't have any personal experience with that data, so I don't know what's real. No, I mean, I just haven't seen any publications that showed this, so I can't speak to that. But what I can say is that you have the most activation in the brain when you're having an epileptic fit. So if you just ramp up the excitatory activity in the brain and you get to more than 10%, which by the way is a nonsense number that came from nowhere, then ultimately you can't do anything. It's the same as being in a coma. So being totally active is just as bad as people being inactive. What you need is you need to be able to make distinctions between patterns that are on or off. So you always want there to be some that are operating and some that are not operating. There needs to be some differentiation here. So it is about balance between inhibition and excitation. And anytime one of those goes out of whack, it's dangerous. So toying with that and trying to improve it, for example, is tricky. There may be some ways to do so, and certainly stimulants that we use do so. They do affect the amount of inhibition and excitation, and sometimes it's specific to regions of the brain, so that you get different effects. And sometimes that's really great, and sometimes you start hallucinating. So, not that that's necessarily bad all the time.
Okay, thank you very much.